is that they assume that this is a process that has to apply uniformly. But that was never the case for Team Proposition. Some VR is good. Governments see that and will be authorized for public use. Some VR is really, really bad, and those are the ones that governments will withhold. Those are the ones that investigations will focus on. We were the side that was actually analogous to drug FDA approval in this way. Two questions in this speech. First, what is the value of virtual reality? Second, what happens to the industry in the long term? But let's first talk about the opposition strategy. They will investigate while development continues. This is a self-mitigating strategy for three reasons. The first is that our argument suggests that a lot of the harms associated with VR are by their nature irreversible, which suggests that we can't allow them to consume that technology prior to investigations. And the second thing is that the difference between the two sides is this. We test on consenting volunteers. They use individuals as guinea pigs. People cannot consent to these harms unless we discover what they are, rendering their entire agency argument useless in their first speech. Thirdly, governments will be more willing to comply to regulations on our side because they cannot resume development otherwise. They do not have that same leverage that we do. They say, well, the problem is that we have to test unfinished products. This is just a bizarre response. We obviously will get them to test a prototype for these investigations. The last speaker says that we create a culture of antagonism. I have three things to say. The first is that they literally use the example of the EU threatening big tech with fines. So obviously the government has mandate to get companies to do what they want them to do. And the second is that governments just do this all the time in all sorts of industries, like stopping the development of drugs. So that claim is out of the thing. We cannot rely on the research that exists already, as per the metaverse, as the last speaker points out, where research institutions are sponsored by Facebook to emit data points and things like that. That is the current research that companies like Facebook and Apple rely on. To the first question then, what is the value of virtual reality? The opposition claim in this debate is as such, that VR is incredibly beneficial, therefore we get more of those benefits, so things like doctors practicing surgery. We told you that these kinds of technologies will be marginally affected by our investigations, and this is why investigations won't take long. The reason is because comprehensible and reliable research on this exists already. Otherwise, opposition wouldn't even be able to say that this is beneficial technology, which governments can just review and confirm. It would be ridiculous for a hospital to use unverified technology on their patients if it could produce long-term harm of which they have to bear the cost of. But let's talk about the cases where it is a form of escapism for individuals. So things like trans individuals. It is obvious at the end of this debate that there are both benefits and harms to VR. And it's clear that the same people will be subject to both. How should you weigh both of these claims then? There are three things to say here. The first is that we point out that beneficial VR won't be affected massively. The second is that both sides can access this VR eventually. Our investigations aren't going to take that long. It's just small control groups to extrapolate likely effects. After these, all of their benefits can happen on our side, so that the most vulnerable they talk about can use this technology safely. I'll talk about what happens in the long term in the second question. And the third is that they could not co-opt our regulations because of what I say at the top of the speech. So we get their benefits, they get our harms. By definition, we win this debate. Given our context, investigations will focus on the very worst kinds of VR. And Brian tells you that the VR industry is changing from specialized industrial use, which is what they want to talk about, to public use. And we showed you why this bad VR is more likely. Exploitative, socially influential companies like Facebook and Apple have ramped up investigations in recent years, and they're also buying up existing VR companies like Oculus. So even if we couldn't point to concrete harms, there is an imperative for governments to intervene based on the scale of use, the actors involved, and the social influence of this technology. So the capacity for abuse is both massive and likely. We think that was enough, but on top of this, we could point to concrete harms, which were by their nature irreversible, which is why we have to stop development now. The first, we do not yet understand the implications of psychological harms that occur in the VR world. Things like virtual sexual assault inducing trauma, things like hyper-realistic gun games, tricking your brain into thinking they're real, can have long-term and irreversible impacts. Extremely targeted ads artificially engineer our preferences and the choices that we make into the future. So that's the first question. Second question then, what happens to the industry in the long term? And obviously it's not too late to respond in government whip, otherwise I might as well not have showed up tonight. The first claim is that the black market will pop up. But the kind of widespread technology that we told you is that what we're actually talking about in this debate does not have widespread demand for this particular technology right now, because people aren't using VR for remote working. People aren't using VR for socialization. Trans individuals aren't using VR right now. So people don't have an incentive to seek out goods on the black market, given that that demand doesn't actually exist right now. So if we stop development, it doesn't change anything. Opposition says, the second claim that they have, is that the industry will now crumble, barring us from accessing long-term benefits. This is incredibly unlikely. And the first reason is that the industry is already an oligopoly. Facebook is acquiring and will continue to buy up VR companies like Big Box and Supernatural to monopolize the industry right now. But there are already incredibly high barriers to entry into that market, like high fixed cost of technology and speculative R&D. There are two implications. Their harm that they point to already exists, and the second is that this will be a massively profitable industry. So these large companies are able to operate at a loss if they have to, by cross-subsidizing their VR development with other revenue streams. Before I move on, I'll take a few while.
Investigating today's technology only finds today's products, or today's problems. You have no mechanism for finding any of the future problems that could arise in the future. Therefore, you lose this debate.
Well, like, the first thing to say is that the kinds of products that we're talking about are just not widespread. Like, the problems of today don't even exist. So obviously we're going to discover them through the use of this technology. So what they talk about, like trans individuals using this kind of technology, or remote working like we talk about, those harms are non-existent on their side because they haven't even been used yet to discover those harms. So yes, VR development continues in the long term, and in fact gets better on the long term on our side. In their best case, more people use it on our side because we restore public trust in big tech. They say this is symmetric, but this is a circular argument because it's contingent on their regulation actually working. But secondly, we told you that investors know exactly what kind of regulation they're up against. So they're far more willing to invest on our side because they don't fear future government intervention, flipping their claim on investment. We think it's time to topple big tech's tyranny, and for that reason, we're very proud